All right, well, thank you for coming out this afternoon. My name is Dr. Nick Sines, and I have the good pleasure to work with Andrew Geber in the fall in a course entitled 20th Century Europe. And it was actually from that course that he developed the project you're about to see. So please join me in welcoming Andrew.
Hi. For those that don't know me, my name is Andrew Geber. I am a mass communication major here at Adams State University. And well, since I was a kid, I have been fascinated by history. And like Dr. Sines said, last semester, I was fortunate enough to get to research a topic that I found pretty interesting, which was tanks during World War I. So we'll get right into it. So World War I, for a little background, was the dawn of modern war. Technology was at the forefront. Trench warfare on land was a sad necessity for all the armies involved. Artillery and the machine gun forced both the Axis and Allied armies in a race to the sea, in which trenches were made along the Western Front all the way up to the English Channel. Speaking of the sea, control of the sea was incredibly vital to these to the combatants here. Whether it was getting resources from colonies abroad or trying to choke out a rival nation, the submarine, along with battleships, were incredibly important to success at sea. The air was a brand new technology at the time. The first ever combat planes were flown and utilized during this period. And they showed the necessity for observation, whether it was troop movement or the preparation for battle, both observing the enemy from the skies and also engaging them was critical. But there's one technology today that I want to talk about that found its genesis during World War I, and that is the tank. The tank was created by the English. It was the tank that was first utilized by the English in combat was the Mark IV. The Mark IV had a rhomboid shape, as you can see here, to traverse trenches and the incredibly muddy, destroyed landscape of no man's land. Conditions inside of these machines were terrible. There is a huge engine that sat right in the middle of the interior. The Mark IV was crewed by 8 people. There was really poor ventilation. They moved at a snail's pace. They were crawling. They were going at about the speed of people walking. And the fumes that were expelled from the machine would poison the crew inside, slowly. It was terrible. But nevertheless, even though they were also incredibly unreliable, the Allies produced them en masse. They produced hundreds upon hundreds of these things. The tank, specifically the British Mark IV, found its debut at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. It wasn't used as the spearhead to a mass assault. It was used more so in conjunction with troop movements, and it was used to relatively decent effect. Since it was the first time these tanks were ever used, or a tank was ever used, it definitely put fear into the Axis soldiers that saw them, but their effect was relatively minimal. They were effective, but not to this degree that they are later in 1917 at the Battle of Cambrai. A surprise assault by the British involving 376 Mark IV tanks stormed the city of Cambrai and resulted in an astounding and very quick British victory on the first day. This battle alone sets the precedent for how effective these machines are in war. This battle alone changed the way we see war today. It is also important to note that about half of those combat tanks were knocked out, and they still achieved their objective. Before I get into German tanks during this time period and their production, I think it is very important to talk about how the Germans saw the war. Now, the discourse of war, if you will, for the German Empire was kind of a relic of the Napoleonic era. The most important things were movement that would eventually decide the outcome of a singular battle, which would decide the outcome of the greater war. Glory, all these kinds of romantic ideas of war are really the key to how Germany saw conflict, armed conflict, both prior to the Great War and during. The tank, along with trench warfare, were seen as the antithesis to this belief. While trench warfare was more of a necessity than an option, it was seen as spiritless. Tanks, a radical new innovation, were seen as soulless, and the attrition seen during the war, the brevity, the lack of glory, were obviously the complete opposite of what the Germans believed. But it is important to note that tanks were seen as alien. The German army specifically didn't really like them. They were slow, they were clunky, they didn't necessarily traverse landscape well, but they knew that they were effective from the day that they saw them. Right after the Somme in 1916, before the Battle of Cambrai, the German military knew we need to produce these things, we need to use them in large groups, and we need to produce more of them after that. The structure of the German army, specifically during this time, is a big reason why production was pretty uneven. The Ministry of War, which was the highest area of the military next to the OHL, was responsible for producing them. The OHL was the Army's operational center, which would implement assets, troops, machines. The operational center really implemented these things, while the Ministry of War researched technology and aided in planning. Now, the first ever German tank design was known as the A7V, not named in a very sexy way. It was named for the multiple departments involved in its creation. There were about 16 different departments involved in construction, and the contractor of the tank, it's a long German phrase, so I'm just going to abbreviate it to VPK. The contractor of the tanks, VPK, originally purchased 100. The idea was to purchase 100 for use in a mass assault, preferably with the benefit of disguise. Now, the first time we see real conflict between how the German army sees tanks internally is pretty much right upon their genesis. The contractor, VPK, and the Army's operational center got into butted heads about whether or not the tank should be armored on the sides and the back from field guns. Now, the VPK and the engineers involved completely disagreed with this, citing German doctrine, and this is pretty terrible German. It's Wirkung geht von Deckung, which loosely translates to effect over cover. The idea that the more effective a machine is in battle is more of it's a more important outcome than being more covered. Adding more armor would mean that the guns that you see right here, you'll see later, would be removed, making it a less effective fighting machine. Now, eventually, the OHL, which could not dismiss the VPK's argument, said, well, they pretty much said it's our way or the highway. They would limit production. They would severely limit production if the VPK did not comply. Ultimately, the VPK complied. The ironic part to this is that ultimately, the VPK was stuck with limited production anyway because of the winter of 16, which I will explain in a little bit. Before I get there, this is actually the A7V, big machine. Instead of 8 people like the Mark IV, crewed by 18 people, 18 plus. It was massive. The commander or the leading officer in the tank would usually sit up here with I believe the driver. There was about a 9-meter blind spot right in the front here. It had 4 machine guns, 2 on each side, a larger cannon here on the front. The track was imported from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, believe it or not. Germany actually didn't even have the technology at the time. And the gun here was imported from a Swedish arms maker in England, I believe. So this is really, you can see already right here, this is a lot of material to be using. And as the war moved forward, materials will be more and more scarce, meaning that the German army would eventually have to figure out exactly what machines they're going to cast their lot in. But this is the A7V, very, very different from the rhomboid design of the Mark IV. Very different. This wasn't as good as at traversing the muddy landscape because of the tracks, but it was way better armored. It had a lot more weaponry. And when it was implemented, even in small numbers, it was very, very effective. So how are these machines received by High Command? General Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, who would eventually become the second president of the Weimar Republic after the war, and Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff, essentially his second in command, were both very unimpressed with the machines when they were being tested. Now, because of German military dogma, like I said, belief in a war of movement, belief in one key battle deciding the outcome of the war, the soulfulness of war, the glory that could be had, it's no surprise really that these two men didn't find them very intriguing. From intelligence gathered by a British officer during the war, both of these men's accounts of the machines were actually documented. Paul von Hindenburg believed that he thinks that they would not be effective, but since they were created, that they deserved at least a trial run. While Erich Ludendorff believed that they should have been heavily cut when it came to their production. Both men are great examples. Their opinions on the machine, great examples of why Germany couldn't decide whether or not they really wanted to cast their lot in with tanks. So, like I said, the winter of 1916, before Cambrai, tank production was halted and there was a new focus on submarines. Resources were incredibly scarce. The Allied blockade of Germany was effective. And it was the belief of High Command that casting their lot in with the submarine would be a surefire way to open up their ports for more trade and strangle the English. Now, this new focus on submarines and unrestricted submarine warfare, ironically enough, was the reason why, one of the reasons, at least outside of the Zimmermann telegraph, why the Americans joined the war. So after the winter of 1916, coming to the spring of 1917, tanks were back on top, at least in limited production. But this was too little too late. The fact that it took so long for the German military to make any decision, well, as a matter of fact, they didn't make any decision at all on these tanks, or any real tangible numbers in machinery to at least help their war-winning capacity. It really is an interesting moment it's really an interesting case in the fact that no decision was the worst decision. Only 20 tanks were ever produced, and only 3 units were made of 5 tanks each, with 1 reserve unit. Now, The idea behind this was that if the tank units proved themselves in battle, mind you, these tank units had no tank doctrine. The main focus of the military at that time was really improving small squad and infantry tactics. The genesis of what we see today in squad movement and autonomy is really found here, pioneered by the German army with their Sturmtruppen, or the stormtroopers. These three units were really given the short end of the stick. They had to prove themselves in battle if more were to ever be produced. And as you can see, High Command didn't really get the chance to ever produce more. So the question is, could German tanks have changed the war? I would argue yes, resoundingly. Now, in the numbers that they were produced, and the fact that they were never utilized correctly in large numbers, German tanks never had a chance to change the war. But from the research I've gathered, I can find an exact case in which mass implementation of these machines could have actually changed quite possibly the world as we know it today. So a little background here. Journey with me now to the spring of 1918. It's been 4 years of total war. Millions of men are dying. Artillery has killed more soldiers than bullets alone. New technology has changed the way we see war. And at this point, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk has freed up hundreds of thousands of soldiers, German soldiers, from the Eastern Front to be used in the West. This area right here was given to Germany right after, actually, the treaty, and all those troops were sent west. There have been tons of casualties on both sides, and an offensive was imminent. This is the moment in which tanks could have changed the face of warfare. Kaiserschlacht, also known as the Emperor's Battle. The idea was to drive a wedge between the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, and the French army in the heart of France at the critical railroad junction of Amiens. Now, Kaiserschlacht was done in multiple different operations, and it had a strong focus on small squad and infantry tactics. The Sturmtruppen were the most elite units of the day. They carried tons of grenades, and their trench raid tactics were again, they were pioneers of how we see warfare today. They moved autonomously of their commanders, and they were incredibly effective fighting force. So effective that the first operation of Kaiserschlacht, Operation Michael, broke the stalemate. Operation Michael here had the most gains out of any conflict or operation in the war, gaining territory in miles, documented in miles other than yards. Unfortunately, they stopped short of Amiens 10 miles. It's my belief that had tanks been utilized and produced in large numbers, those 10 miles could have been made up. Driving a wedge to the between the British Expeditionary Force up to the English Channel and driving the French army further south. Unfortunately, without tanks, it was a complete and utter operational failure. Tactically, it was a success. The German army gained more ground than they could handle. In fact, they were spread so thin that they were eventually beaten back in the subsequent Battle of Amiens. Kaiserschlacht was the last German offensive of the war. And if tanks had been utilized in large number and produced in large number, that might not be the case. And if Kaiserschlacht was successful and Amiens was taken, the German army could have sued for a peace that was more equitable than what was found at Versailles. Versailles being one of the biggest reasons why the Nazis took over. Ultimately, I mean, if we're going far here, if we're going deep, changing the face of the world as we see it. But tanks here could have changed the war. And that is the core argument to the paper that I wrote and the core argument that I'm bringing you here today. Thank you. I have time for questions if any of you guys have any questions that you wanted to ask. So mechanically, they were unreliable. They had a really hard time traversing through the incredibly wet, muddy, difficult terrain of no man's land. The Mark IV did it better than most of the other tanks, but the engine was just not great. It was really primitive technology as it came to tanks. I mean, this is really where we see them exist. So a lot of the kinks hadn't been worked out. Having a big old open engine was, a bit of an issue. They also weren't necessarily, they were very helpful when it came to protection against bullets, small arms fire, but a direct artillery, and shrapnel as well, which, like I said, is the largest killer in the war. But with direct artillery fire, it wasn't that well protected. Compared to tanks in World War II, huge difference, massive difference. Anybody else?
So we're thinking about this technology, the tank versus things like submarines, trench warfare, the machine guns. Would you make a case for this being the most significant technology introduced in your life?
That's a very...
There's a strategy, but in terms of significance.
I would argue it's about equal to the plane. I think tanks were really the segue from static trench warfare, in which people didn't understand exactly how to break the stalemate of artillery fire on both sides. I think tanks were an important segue to the war of movement that was seen in World War II and beyond. But at the same time, the plane is really a military machine that is really important. I mean, I think they're equally important, because if you look at the Blitzkrieg in World War II, you couldn't have it without armored troops, armored infantry, and air support. Anybody else?
When did the American military adopt tanks, and did they innovate their own kind of technologies with it, or did they kind of just copy what the Germans did?
Well, nobody really copied what the Germans did. The Mark IV was really the Mark IV was a propaganda machine along with an effective machine of war. But the Americans, as far as I know, didn't really copy anything the Germans did. I want to say they worked, that's a tough question, because I don't really think the Americans ever made their own tanks during World War I. I'm pretty sure they either borrowed from the French, who produced quite a few tanks, or the English. It's also important to note that the Americans didn't arrive in full on the continent until after Kaiserschlacht. Kaiserschlacht was really the first kind of time we see American troops, at least there in the country, in Europe, which was also why it was so important for the Germans to drive a wedge between the French and the British, because the Americans were on the way. And that manpower mostly, and the logistics were critical. But I can't really say the Americans really copied the Germans. Really, their own tank production was way later in the war. Anybody else? Sweet. Yeah, thank you guys. I really appreciate it.